In an age when kingdoms were not ruled by laws but by whispered promises, power did not always sit on the throne. Often, it stood quietly behind velvet curtains, listening, watching, and waiting. This was a world where alliances were forged over candle-lit dinners and destroyed before dawn. A world where a single marriage could end a war or begin one. Kings wore crowns heavy with gold, but even heavier with fear. Every smile at court concealed intention. Every bow masked ambition. The royal court was not merely a place of ceremony. It was a battlefield without blood, where survival depended not on strength of arms, but on wit, reputation, and influence. Women, especially, were judged harshly by history, yet many of them shaped the fate of kingdoms more decisively than any general. Among these women stood figures who understood the language of power better than most men who claimed to rule. One such woman was Madame de Longueville. She did not arrive at court as an innocent maiden, untouched by life's realities. She came with experience that made men uneasy and rivals cautious. A widow, already the mother of 2 sons, she carried herself with a calm authority that could not be taught. In a society that prized purity in words but rewarded cunning in action, her past was both a weapon and a shield. The court spoke of her quietly at first. They noted her composure. They observed her presence. They whispered about her influence. She was not the loudest voice in the room, yet conversations shifted when she entered. Decisions seemed to lean in her direction without her ever raising her voice. To some, she was a practical choice. To others, a dangerous one. But in the silent calculations of power, suitability was not measured by innocence. It was measured by capability. And Madame de Longueville had plenty of that. The kingdom itself stood at a fragile moment. The king, aging and surrounded by rivals, needed stability more than admiration. He required someone who understood loss, loyalty, and the consequences of legacy. A woman who had already borne sons understood the future in ways no advisor could explain. Yet suitability at court was never just about logic. It was about perception. And perception, once formed, could alter the fate of nations. As whispers grew louder and choices narrowed, the court began to realize something unsettling. Madame de Longueville was not merely a participant in history. She was about to become one of its architects. The kingdom had survived many storms, but it had learned one lesson above all others: noise attracted danger. Outwardly, the capital appeared calm. Markets opened at sunrise. Church bells rang on schedule. Courtiers smiled, bowed, and exchanged pleasantries as if nothing beneath the surface was broken. But silence in this kingdom was never peace. It was restraint. Every corridor of the royal palace carried echoes of conversations that had never been spoken aloud. Guards stood motionless, not because they were loyal, but because they were watching. Servants learned quickly that survival depended on hearing everything and repeating nothing. The king understood this silence better than anyone. Once a man of decisive action, he had grown cautious with age. Not weak, just aware. A crown teaches its wearer that enemies rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as friends, advisors, even family. His council chamber was filled with men who spoke confidently and advised cautiously. Each one claimed loyalty, yet each one calculated his own future. The kingdom's stability rested on fragile agreements, marriages, promises, and carefully managed appearances. And appearances mattered more than truth. That was why the question of succession and alliance had become urgent. The court needed continuity, the people needed reassurance, and the nobles needed to know where power would settle next. Rumors alone could ignite unrest. A single poor decision could fracture decades of fragile order. It was in this climate that discussions turned, again and again, toward Madame de Longueville. Unlike others at court, she did not rush to be noticed. She attended gatherings without seeking attention, spoke when necessary, and listened far more than she spoke. Silence to her was not weakness, it was leverage. Her widowhood granted her a rare position, freedom mixed with respect. She was no longer bound by youthful expectation, yet not diminished by it either. Having already borne 2 sons, her role as a mother lent her credibility in a court obsessed with legacy. Some nobles viewed her as practical. Others viewed her as unpredictable. But no one dismissed her. Behind closed doors, advisors debated carefully. "She understands loss," one said. "She understands power," said another. "And she understands men," whispered a third. The king listened, without revealing his thoughts. He had seen young brides fail under the weight of expectation. He had watched alliances collapse because innocence proved impractical. What the kingdom needed now was not idealism, but endurance. Madame de Longueville represented endurance. Yet her growing relevance unsettled many at court. Influence, especially when quiet, makes enemies quickly. Rival factions began to form, not openly but subtly. Invitations were withheld. Rumors were shaped. Questions were planted where answers could do damage. Still, she remained composed. Those closest to her noticed something others missed. She was preparing, not reacting. Every conversation served a purpose. Every relationship was measured, not emotional. She understood that in a kingdom built on silence, survival depended on timing. And timing was shifting. The king's health was failing faster than public appearances suggested. Succession was no longer a distant concern. It was approaching. Whoever stood closest to the center of power now would shape what came next. Madame de Longueville knew this. So did her enemies. And as the palace continued its daily rituals, one truth became unavoidable. The silence that had protected the kingdom for years was beginning to crack. Madame de Longueville had learned early that power did not always announce itself. It arrived quietly, through endurance, reputation, and patience. Her widowhood, once considered a weakness, had become her greatest advantage. She no longer needed permission to speak, nor approval to exist. Her past gave her authority, her children gave her purpose, and her restraint gave her mystery. Men at court struggled to define her, and that uncertainty unsettled them. She moved through the palace with calm confidence, aware that every glance carried judgment. Yet she neither challenged nor avoided it. She allowed others to underestimate her, knowing that assumption was often fatal. Power, she believed, was not seized. It was invited. In royal courts, bloodlines mattered more than loyalty. Madame de Longueville's 2 sons were not merely children, they were symbols, proof of continuity. Evidence of stability. The court saw in them a future already formed. Nobles who once dismissed her now reconsidered. A woman who had already raised heirs understood sacrifice, compromise, and responsibility. She was not driven by romantic illusion, but by legacy. The king observed this shift closely. He knew that heirs anchored power. They calmed restless nobles and reassured fearful citizens. A woman who brought heirs into the equation changed everything. The palace breathed rumors like air. Whispers followed Madame de Longueville through corridors and chambers. Some spoke of admiration, others of suspicion. Her composure became a topic of debate. She listens too carefully. She speaks too little. She knows more than she says. Each whisper added to her presence, shaping a narrative she never publicly addressed. She understood that reputation was not built by defense, but by consistency. And so she remained steady, letting others argue while she advanced quietly. The king faced a decision history would judge harshly. His reign had been long, but time spared no ruler. His body weakened while pressure mounted. Advisors urged caution. Rivals urged speed. He needed someone beside him who would not collapse under scrutiny, someone who understood loss, politics, and restraint. Madame de Longueville fit that role uncomfortably well. Yet choosing her meant angering factions who preferred innocence over experience. The king weighed risk against survival. For the first time, he considered not what was admired, but what endured. Madame de Longueville's reputation extended beyond intellect. She was spoken of as captivating, not loudly but persistently. Her presence commanded attention without demanding it. In a court obsessed with appearances, this balance was rare. But beauty at court was a double-edged sword. Admiration quickly turned to accusation. Influence was often mislabeled as manipulation. She accepted this burden without protest. Power, she knew, always came at a cost. And she was willing to pay it. Marriage, in royal terms, was never personal. It was a transaction, measured, negotiated, deliberate. The idea of aligning with Madame de Longueville was not about affection. It was about advantage. Her experience balanced the king's uncertainty. Her heirs stabilized the future. Her reputation commanded respect abroad. Some nobles resisted fiercely, others supported quietly. But strategy favored her. And strategy, in the end, always won. Opposition did not arrive with swords. It arrived smiling. Rivals dressed in elegance, spoke in courtesy, and plotted in private. They praised Madame de Longueville publicly while undermining her influence behind closed doors. She recognized them easily. Enemies who feared confrontation were the most dangerous. They moved slowly, poisoning opinion rather than drawing blood. Madame de Longueville responded not with force, but with patience. Time, she believed, exposed everyone. As her influence grew, so did resistance. Power attracted ambition, jealousy, and desperation. Every step forward increased the stakes. Every choice narrowed her escape. Madame de Longueville understood now that retreat was no longer possible. She had entered the center of the political storm. Desire for stability